Right. Well, welcome everyone to this evening's program. Welcome to the Hampshire Bird Club Education Committee's workshop on coastal birding. Mike Locher is going to be our presenter tonight. And Mike has been a member of the Bird Club for many years and has led many field trips for the Hampshire Bird Club. Additionally, he was a field trip committee chairperson for a while as well. Mike is an educator, so we're always glad when he can present a workshop for us. He learned about the coast, I believe, by birding with Bob Beta and Al Richards. Is that right, Mike? Great.
Right. Yep.
All right. So I will I'll turn it over to you, Mike, and we'll get started. Thanks so much.
All right.
Could I just interject quickly? Sorry to interrupt. If people have questions, if you would be kind enough to put them in the chat, and I'll be the sort of monitor of that towards the end of the presentation. So that way you won't forget your question, and we'll get to them when Mike is finished. Thanks.
All right. I think I'm sharing my screen right now. If I seem to be sharing my screen, do you see it?
Yes. Yes, we do.
Excellent. Excellent. So the topic I decided to talk about tonight is loons, grebes, and alcids of the Massachusetts coast. Last time I was doing a presentation about this time of year, I did the waterfowl, I did ducks. And so I figured I'd concentrate on some different families and some that are a little bit more difficult perhaps to tell apart. So the first thing is the plan. And my goal is to explore some of the birds that you might find on the ocean off Massachusetts coast. And I'm going to separate this into 3 different families, because I think if you can distinguish the families, and we'll talk about how to do that, then figuring out which bird you're seeing becomes a lot easier, rather than taking a dozen different birds and trying to figure out which one it is. I want to break it first into families. Then we'll talk about all the species that you're likely to see here off the coast of Massachusetts. Then we'll talk about a few of the rarities that you might see. I'm just going to offer a few comments on those. And I'll provide a list of places where you can actually see some of these birds. And there will be a quiz. Janice Jorgensen said I had to have a quiz. So you're all responsible for answering the quiz questions correctly. So first up, most of these birds are seen well offshore, which means it's really beneficial to have a scope. You can do it with binoculars, but frequently you'll see a bird way out on the waves, and without that extra magnification that a scope can give you, trying to make an identification is really just guesswork. So try to get a scope if you actually go out trying to seek these birds, or a really, really long lens on a camera. The way I try to work this kind of birding is I usually set myself up at a spot that's got a good view of the ocean, and I start scanning with binoculars. And I'm trying to pick out single birds, single gray, white, and black birds, because that's the colors that these birds present. Usually they are individuals. Some of them will tend to congregate, especially some of the alcids, but often they'll be in a very loose aggregation, but you'll only find 1 or 2 in any particular scope view. Unlike ducks, ducks tend to flock. Most of the birds I'm talking about tonight are much more singular. And when I finally find something, that's when I take my scope and I take it at the lowest power, and I start gradually, patiently scanning the area where I think I saw a bird. And the issue with all of these birds I'll be talking about tonight is they are all divers. So it's quite possible that you can see that bird with your binoculars, get a scope right on it 10 seconds later, and the bird's down. So you've got to be very patient, just scanning back and forth. Once I've locked on to something, maybe I increase the zoom on my scope to try and get more magnification. But I find this is a pretty effective way to try to bird the ocean. Some people start right with the scope, and many of them are probably very successful, but you're often scanning a lot of very, very empty water before you actually land on a bird. I'm often amazed at how I can scan with my binoculars and see nothing out on the ocean. But if you put your scope out there, you can suddenly see a great deal. And you'll find loons that are in the waves. You'll find some alcids. You'll find some grebes. So if you don't happen to see anything with your binoculars, go ahead and set up the scope and start scanning and see what you can find. And since I'm primarily talking about birding in the winter and birds in winter plumage, bundle up. It is much more pleasant to be unfashionably bundled than it is to be in your chicest possible winter wear and be freezing with your eyes tearing up. So wear a heavy, heavy winter coat, eye protection, mittens, whatever it takes to keep you warm out there, because it can be bitterly cold trying to find these birds. So the first family I want to talk about are the loons, and I want to focus just on silhouettes and trying to tell these different families apart based on their silhouettes. So loons have long bodies that tend to remain about half out of the water. They've got moderately long necks, so you can definitely tell they've got necks, but the necks are fairly thick. They've got large heads, although one of our loon species, the one displayed in the lower picture, is often called a snakehead because the distinction between the neck and the head is not as great as it is in the top picture, which is a common loon. But the real key feature of these birds is the long pointed bills, and these bills are very, very large. So for loons, you're looking for a long body, partly out of the water, fairly long but thick neck, big heads, and very long pointed bills. The next family I want to talk about is grebes. So you'll notice from this picture of a grebe that it looks quite a bit different from those two pictures of the loons. Not all grebes look like this. Grebes come in a variety of shapes and sizes. So one thing that you can try to focus on with all grebes is they've got a relatively short body, shorter looking than the loons. And part of that is because they've got this really, really long, thin, erect neck, which tends to make the body look a little bit shorter, I think. They've also got a fairly small looking head on top of that thin neck. And the bill is small and pointed, and it's short. So very different than the loons, which have these very, very long extended bills. Grebe bills tend to be a lot shorter. Then there are the alcids. And again, alcids come in a variety of shapes and sizes. What I pictured here does not look like all alcids in the world, but they tend to have short bodies. They tend to have almost a no neck appearance in many cases. They do have a very short, thick neck, but it's very, very difficult to see often. They've got kind of a medium-sized head, but the bills of these species are all over the board, from puffins, which have these massive bills, to dovekies, which barely have any kind of bills at all. So the alcids in many ways are the toughest, but if you can recognize that it's not a loon because it doesn't have enough of a neck and not enough of a body, and it's not a grebe because it doesn't have that long, thin, erect neck, then you're pretty well locked into an alcid for what you're looking at. And so that limits your possible choices. These birds also have differences in the way they dive. And if you pay attention to them, that can give you a real clue as to what kind of bird you're looking at. All of these birds, I will say, have denser bones than many birds, which makes diving a viable option for them. A lot of birds have a lot of difficulty diving because their bones are very, very light, and they've got their feathers trapping air and so on. But all of these birds have relatively dense bones. And in fact, all of these birds can dive in a variety of ways. And I'll talk about that in particular when I talk about the grebes. If you watch loons and grebes dive, there's one thing that they never do, and that's because loons and grebes propel themselves underwater with their feet. And so they keep their wings tight into their bodies when they dive. They are different than the alcids. The alcids actually flap through the water with their wings. And so they can't dive with their wings tight to their body, or they never have the strength to lift those wings out and start flapping. Instead, they've got to spread their wings before they go underwater. And so that provides one of the differences that you look for. If you're a loon, you're typically swimming along and you just dive, you just put your head in the water and you follow with your body. So loons, it's almost like a submarine going down to me. The loon head goes down and then the rest of the body smoothly follows after it. There's almost never a splash when a loon dives. It's a very smooth motion. And when they go down, because they go down so smoothly, you typically don't see any of the white that's on the belly of the loon as they go down. Grebes, on the other hand, they also only use their feet, so they don't care about using their wings when they dive. Grebes, to me, often look like they leap forward into the water. They create a little bit of a splash, and you get a little bit of that white belly as they dive into the water. Alcids, on the other hand, spread their wings before they dive. So they typically flare those wings, pop up, go down into the water, and their feet are visible as they submerge, unlike the loons and grebes. Now, this is tough to see. If you're watching an alcid from way far away, it's going to be hard to pick out those feet. But if you do happen to see that wing flare and the feet, that's an excellent clue that you're looking at an alcid. Finally, flying behavior. And there's not as much difference between these three different families as you'd like to see when you're trying to distinguish them. Loons and grebes both fly with a fully extended neck. And that's going to be different than a species I'll talk about a little later, the cormorants. But loons and grebes fly with a fully extended neck, and they've got their feet extended behind as well. Loons are entirely dark on top, whereas grebes typically have white wing patches. And that's something we'll see when we look at the individual species. Turns out alcids also fly with extended necks. They just don't have any necks to extend. So it looks like their heads don't extend very far past their wings. So that's the main thing that I look for when I see these birds in flight. You can tell the difference between a loon and grebe when they're flying at a distance. A lot of it has to do with size. Loons are a lot bigger than most grebes. Some of it has to do with how high they hold their necks. But if you see a bird that doesn't have a neck, then chances are really, really good it's an alcid. All of these birds have very fast, direct flight with rapid wing beats. They tend to fly very, very close to the surface of the water, and most of them require a running takeoff. These birds are not, they're designed to be in the water, and they spend most of their time diving. So they're not particularly great flyers, or they're strong flyers, but they aren't designed to necessarily take off. Some of you may have heard of loons in migration that accidentally try to land on a road, and that's frozen, looks like a river. And many of those loons are going to pass away because they just don't have the ability to take off again once they've landed. So the first species that we'll look at is the common loon. And this is the common loon in its winter plumage. During breeding season, these birds have a similar but very different, much more colorful, gaudier sort of pattern. Notice that the common loon, especially in the top picture, has a very, very large dagger-like bill that's held level. Notice the white on the throat. And in the picture of the flying bird, you can see the white on the belly and the white on the underwings. Notice that the line on the throat, so if you track the black-white divide from the eye down the throat, there's an interruption there. It's not completely smooth, and this is sometimes called the collar on a common loon. That collar is going to help us distinguish this bird from the other main loon species that we have in the area. Common loons have very large heads, and those large heads are clearly distinguishable from the neck. And the front of the head often looks peaked, and it makes an angle with the bill. So it sort of looks like the forehead comes down and the beak is taking off at a very, very different angle. So contrast this with the red-throated loon, which is our other main loon off the coast of Massachusetts in the winter. Notice the difference between the bills. This bird has a long, thin bill, and it's held with an upward tilt. I'm going to go back to the previous slide where you can see the much thicker, heavier bill of the common loon held at a fairly neutral angle compared to the slightly up-tilted, much thinner red-throated loon. They've also got white on the throat, belly, and underwings. You can't see it very well in the flying picture, but under the wings of these birds, it is in fact white. But take a look at that top picture and look at the line between the white throat and the gray neck. That line looks fairly smooth. And I'm going to flick back to the common loon, where you can see that that's not a smooth line the whole way down the neck. It's broken there by that intrusion of the black feathers into that white throat, whereas the red-throated loon doesn't have that. It can often be difficult to tell the difference between the darker gray or black of the common loon and the lighter gray of the red-throated loon. But if you happen to see a grayer head, that's a pretty good clue you're dealing with a red-throated loon as well. There is more white on the face of a red-throated loon than you'll find with a common loon. And notice the way that this small head kind of merges with the neck. Take a look particularly at the picture of the flying bird. You can't really separate where the head begins and where the neck ends. Interestingly enough, for these species, this is one that can take flight without a run-up. So they can just explode directly out of the water, much like the dabbling ducks do. Those are the loons. We only have 2 loon species that we commonly see off the coast of Massachusetts, although there are 2 other possibilities I'll talk about later. Our grebes, the horned grebe. Again, notice the difference. It's got a fairly long, thin neck, and it holds that neck very, very upright. Even with the loons, actually, that's not a great picture. Both of them are pretty upright as well. But this bird just looks really, really upright to me. And because of that, I think it makes its body look compact. So it's got a small, compact, it's got its thin neck held erect. It's got a very small bill, unlike the loons. And notice the contrast of the white face with the black cap. And as you go back along the cheek and the neck, there's that huge white patch on the horned grebe that you don't see on the loons, and you don't see on other grebes either. It almost looks like there's a white patch that wraps the whole way around the neck. Horned grebe will show white above the waterline, as you can see in the top picture. That was not true of either of the loons, although loons tend to sometimes roll over and preen while they're on the water, showing their white bellies. But in general, loons don't show nearly this much white, if any. And in flight, notice those prominent white wing patches that the grebe has. This is common to almost all species of grebes. They've got that big white wing patch, which you'd never see on a loon, and you don't see it on many alcids either. Ringneck grebe, or sorry, redneck grebe. Redneck grebe is a much larger bird, very long, thin neck, held erect, and it's got a proportionately long but yellow bill. Sometimes the redneck grebe can be mistaken for a red-throated loon just because of the general shape of the neck, long and thin, and that long bill. But the bill here is very, very yellow. And the pattern of white on the face is very, very different than you see on a red-throated loon. There is no white on the water above the waterline with a red-necked grebe. Again, notice in flight, you've got prominent white wing patches and additionally a shoulder patch. These are the two grebes that we would expect to see out on the ocean. Pied-billed grebes are also around, but they tend not to be birds of the open ocean. They tend to be a little bit inland, maybe they're in bays, but often they'll look for ponds or lakes that are slightly inland, as opposed to being out in the waves of the open ocean. Now the alcids. I have never in my life seen an alcid at anything approaching close range. I've seen plenty of them. I tend to catch glimpses of them as they dive down, and then they emerge half a mile from where they dove down, it seems. These birds can be very, very difficult to get a good look at it. They appear entirely black and white. There are no shades of gray here. They've got a large, very, very thick bill. And notice the way the white extends from the neck behind the eye. There's a sharp black spur at the base of the neck. And that I find a fairly interesting mark if I can see it well. So I look for that bright white throat. There's sort of a fuzzy whitish patch behind the eye. And then that little shoulder patch, which is very, very sharp, is different than almost all the rest of these birds. In flight, it kind of looks like a football with wings. In fact, many of the alcids tend to have that sort of effect. And you can't see it in my picture, but it's got a clean white underwing. But notice on the top, that's just a plain black wing. So that can't be a grebe. And the whole shape of it is wrong for a loon. It doesn't have enough neck. So if you see those black tops to the wings and the short neck with the bill that just doesn't stick out very far, doesn't look like it sticks out very far, then you know you've probably got an alcid of some variety, and it might be a razorbill. The common murre. Again, black and white, no shades of gray at all on this bird. It's got a somewhat loon-like bill, and notice that in this picture, at least, it's holding that bill slightly upright. So if you were to see this bird in silhouette, not really see the colors, you might think you had a red-throated loon. But the murres are much smaller. It can be very hard to judge distance when these birds are out in the ocean, but it is distinctly smaller than the 25-inch red-throated loon and the 32-inch common loon. And with a little practice out on the ocean, you can begin to judge relative size pretty well. It's not perfect, but pretty well. There's a big, big white patch on the face and the hind neck. The black spur behind the eye is difficult to see, but that is a distinguishing mark if you happen to see it. And notice the more rounded black lobe at the base of the neck. The razorbill had that very, very sharp lobe, and in the common murre, it's often much more rounded. Notice in the flight picture that the underwing is kind of dusky white or gray, and that's different than the razorbill. The razorbill is very, very clean white under there. So if you happen to see one flying over, or the light is right, you happen to see the underwings, if it looks a little bit dusky, maybe you're dealing with a common murre. Here's the easy one. Surprisingly enough, the black guillemot is not black when you see it in the winter. These birds are very pale, and they can almost be pure white in some cases. Usually they look a little bit sooty. So they look white, but they've got some very dark patches on them. However, as you can see in the flight picture, the wings and tail maintain their black feathering. And that wing pattern that you see is right smack in the middle of the wing. It's not out on the edge as it is for the grebes. So that's the same white pattern that black guillemots show during the summer. And again, with a good look, you can tell that that's not the same wing patch that the grebes have. So that would probably be a black guillemot. I often find that guillemots are a little bit closer to shore than the other alcids. Razorbills and murres do occasionally come close to shore, but I typically see them much further off, whereas guillemots I seem to see more frequently and closer into shore. And the last of the alcids that I want to talk about as our common birds is the dovekie, and the dovekie is tiny. It's got a pattern somewhat like the razorbill. Notice that big white extension up behind the eye, and it's got that little black shoulder spur, but it's got no neck, and it's got a tiny bill. In flight, it's actually got dark underwings that contrast with the white belly. But to be honest, if you see a dovekie, you're unlikely to mistake it for anything else, because these birds are tiny. And unfortunately, they're typically far out in the ocean. I'm sure there are probably many of them out there, and we just don't see them as we scan the ocean because they're very, very small. But if you see dovekies flying, it's pretty certain that it's a dovekie just based on the way it's flying and the size more than anything else. So those are our common species. I went over 2 loons, a pair of grebes, about 4 of the alcids. So now this is the way they stack up as far as size. Notice that the loons are the 2 largest species, and common loon is one that you can learn to pick out really, really easily. We'll talk about the rarities. There's one rarity that rivals the common loon for size, but once you get used to the loons, then the others become the ones that you really have to focus on. Notice that the redneck grebe is right in there with the common murre and the razorbill, all of them between 17 and 18 inches. But that redneck grebe is going to have a much thinner neck, holding it much more erect. And the grebe and the murre are going to have just shorter necks. They're going to be a little bit squatter looking in the water. Horn grebe, black guillemot, dovekie. Dovekie is a quarter the size of a common loon. They're small. They're about the size of a small thrush. That 8.25 inches is smaller than a robin. So these are not big birds. So here's how the quiz works. I'm going to post a picture of a species, and I'm going to give you 4 possible identifications. It's all multiple choice, so I'll label the identifications A, B, C, and D, just like when you were in school. You'll get about 10 seconds to put your answer in the chat. And if you're all shy and refuse, I'll assume that I've already put you to sleep, and I'll just stop the program and wrap it up. So it's up to you.
Mike, can you see the chat?
I can.
Okay, great.
All right, looks like a lot of people are going for the redneck grebe. Had 1 or 2 who said the horn grebe, so I'm pleased that people seem to have identified the correct family. This bird is just, the neck is way too much out of the water to be a loon, and it's got too much of a neck to be the common murre. But notice this big yellow bill. It's an immature redneck grebe. So those of you who answered D, that is absolutely correct. Nicely done. Looks like I didn't fool anybody with this one. So notice the medium length, fairly thick neck, the large peaked head, and the big dagger-like bill held level. This is a common loon. Red-throated loon would have a thinner bill held slightly upright. The common murre and the black guillemot would have, to my eye, a proportionally shorter body, and they'd have even less neck than this bird has. Third quiz. Looks like everybody's agreeing on this one as well. Yeah, it's a small bill, so it can't be a dovekie. And it's got a short neck, so not a grebe, can't be a razor bill because of that bill. So by process of elimination, it's a common murre. Notice that black spike behind the eye, which you can see even on this somewhat mottled face. So that's a common murre. And that's the end of the quiz. Nicely done, all of you. I'll tell Janice that you all got A's. So each of these families that I've talked about has several species that could show up on the Massachusetts coast, but they do so very, very rarely. So I'm going to devote 1 slide to each of those groups, and then I'm going to add 1 more family that is occasionally mistaken for particularly loons and grebes. So the unusual loons, the possibilities are yellow-billed and Pacific loons. I don't believe there's ever been a confirmed record of the Arctic loon in Massachusetts, and they are extraordinarily rare anywhere from Eastern Canada down to Florida. Arctic loons just don't show up. But take a look at that picture of the yellow-billed loon. It's very, very large. And in many ways, it looks almost identical to the common loon. It's got the big head, it's got that peaked forehead that makes an angle with a huge bill, but it's got a very pale head and it's got a big yellow bill. One thing that you got to be careful of, common loons can go through a variety of different plumage variations, and their bills actually change as they age. And sometimes in some light, the common loon will have a very, very pale bill. I birded once with Jeff LeBaron down in, I believe it was Rhode Island, and we saw a bird, and Jeff said, wow, that looks like a yellow-billed loon. And we sent a picture to an expert, another expert, and he said, no, it's just a common loon with an unusual bill coloration. But they do occur. They occur annually along the East Coast somewhere, and often along Massachusetts coast. So be on the lookout for things that look like common loons. When you see a common loon, take a close look at that head where the beady eye will show out on the yellow-billed loon, and that big yellow bill will show up as well. Pacific loons look a lot like miniaturized common loons, but they've got slim bills. Notice that bill is even slimmer than a red-necked loon, red-throated loon. They look like, as I said, miniaturized common loons. Often gulls will mob these birds because a ring-billed gull is not that much smaller than a Pacific loon, whereas I've never really seen a gull harass a common loon. They're just too big, too powerful, so the gull's not going to get that snack. But with something like a Pacific loon, they might. So yellow-billed loons and Pacific loons are possibilities. Arctic loons, you'd better have really good photographs. The possible grebes that we might get are western and eared grebes. As I mentioned earlier, pied-billed grebes tend to stay away from the open ocean. Western grebes are very large. They're the size of red-throated loons. So they look superficially like the redneck grebe, but they are much larger, and they've got that really, really long, slim bill with a really, really white throat. We could get western grebes out here. We don't seem to get Clark's grebes, but western grebes do occasionally show up. Eared grebes also show up. They've got less white on the face than horned grebes, but otherwise they look extraordinarily similar to the horned grebes. But both of these birds are seen, and I believe several eared grebes have been reported off the coast of Massachusetts this winter. Unusual alcids. The two that I'm going to focus on here are the thick-billed mirror and the Atlantic puffin. And the thick-billed mirror looks a lot like the common myrrh. Notice it's got a little bit less white on its face. So the common myrrh had that sort of eye streak. The thick-billed myrrh doesn't have that. Trying to make that judgment based on the size of the bill is going to be really, really difficult. It does, in fact, have a thicker bill, but trying to see that with the scope is going to be nearly impossible. Western puff or Atlantic puffins, on the other hand, do have a really thick bill. And it's somewhat surprising that we don't see more of those, given the fact that they breed not too far from us. But in winter, this is not the clown bird that everybody loves to take pictures of. They're fairly nondescript. The bill has gone much, much darker. The face is very, very gray. And so they're still distinctive because of that huge bill, but they may sometimes actually be mistaken for something like razor bills, which also have large bills. Notice that the puffins do seem to have a slightly longer neck, but it's a very, very thick neck than the other alcids. So those are the potential rarities that we see off the coast. The yellow-billed loon, the Pacific loon, the western grebe, the eared grebe, the thick-billed murre, and the Atlantic puffin. And right now, I think just over the past week, sightings off the coast of Cape Cod and the eastern coast of Massachusetts, probably 4 of these 6 species are being seen regularly at certain locations out there. But they tend to be at 1 or 2 locations and not spread all up and down the coast the way the commoner birds were. Last family I want to talk about is the cormorants. And the reason I want to talk about the cormorants is people will occasionally see these things in the ocean and mistake them for either the loons or the grebes. They mistake them for the loons, I think, primarily because of the way they hold their bills. So they look a little bit like the red-throated loon. They've got that bill that's held upright. It's fairly slim. If you take a good look at the bill, you'll see the bill shape is very different. The cormorant has a hooked bill. If you can see the color on the bill, you'll see that it's bright yellow. The neck is wrong for a loon. It's just way too long and thin, but it looks a little bit like a grebe neck. So some people may mistake it for a redneck grebe. So be aware of them. They tend to swim with their bodies almost completely submerged in the water, but they have these long, thin necks, the medium heads, the long bills, and we get 2 different species. The species I'm showing here in these pictures are double-crested cormorants, but we also get a few great cormorants. So, places to bird. I'm going to start north, somewhere around Salisbury State Park and Plum Island, and then I'm going to dip down through the Cape Cod Bay, and then I'll go back up the Cape. So the prime spots to look for these birds are Plum Island. There are a variety of different places on Plum Island where you can find a nice ocean view and you can scan the waves. If you go back to Newburyport, you can look out over the bay there, but you're probably not going to see some of these species, particularly the alcids, in the bay. You have to look off the coast in the waves with very little other land in view. One of my favorite places to go birding in the winter is Cape Ann, and I highly recommend Halibut Point State Park and Andrews Point. They're 2 of my favorite sites, but there are many, many more good sites along Cape Ann. And occasionally some of these birds, including the rarer ones, will come very, very close to shore into some of the little inlets there along Cape Ann. Andrews Point can be very, very difficult for parking, but there are 1 or 2 spots that are available. Just be careful. Usually in the winter, you're not going to irritate people too much just because there aren't a lot of people out there, but be aware that parking can be an issue. As you go further down the coast, Marblehead and Nahant, again, parking can be very difficult, but it's mostly for spring migration that parking gets used up. But if you can find parking, both of them offer great views of the ocean and the possibility of seeing any of these species. Further down the coast, Scituate and Cohasset, both of these towns have good ocean views, and they've got some public beaches where you can park and set up a scope and scan the ocean at leisure. Then there's Manomet Point. And I kind of feel like the water is calmer here than further north. And I'm not sure why I feel like that. It may just be the days that I've happened to go there. I feel like, you know, you're not looking at a bird that's constantly bobbing out of sight because of the waves, but the wind can be just as bad. So, you know, take it or leave it. And then out on Cape Cod, anywhere from Monomoy to Provincetown, you can find good viewing areas on both sides of the Cape. Although again, I do tend to recommend the ocean side when you're looking for a lot of these birds. Up around the Provincetown area recently, they've been seeing quite a few of these species. So how do you find where to go? If you're familiar with eBird, or even if you're not familiar with eBird, you can use the species maps feature and zoom in to the Massachusetts coast. So type in common murre. It'll show you a picture of the world with the world distribution of common murres. And if you zoom into the Massachusetts coast, look for bright red teardrops, and those indicate the recent sightings for any of these birds. And I think I've got my acknowledgements. That's it for the presentation. Now I've got to figure out how to stop sharing. Or get out of my screen. All right.
Great. So thank you, Mike. This is wonderful. And before we totally finish up, we have a couple of questions from the chat. And let me pull them up here. Some weird screen things are happening. The first question is from Janice Sepko. Is the photo of the yellow-billed loon typical of its winter plumage?
Excellent question. I'll have to go back and check that. But I think it is. I think its head was very pale gray. And I think it tends to be grayer in the winter than the summer. But I have that labeled in the acknowledgements, and I'm going to share my presentation with the education committee so they can post it or distribute it. And you can see there after I check and make sure.
Great, thank you. The next question from Bill, are we likely to see the thick-billed murre in the summer?
You are not likely to see the thick-billed murre in the summer. It's a hard bird to find off the coast of Massachusetts. It appears annually, but you want to go further north to try to find those typically.
Okay, and here's a comment here. We had a western grebe at Mashpee Pond on January 7th with Janice Sepko.
Nice, nice.
Very
Yep.
cool. A couple of other just comments. Thank you, Mike. Great presentation. And Michael, that was awesome. You have a very relaxing voice. You kept it very straightforward and simple, elegant. That's great. Thank you, Mike. Professionally well done. And I will just echo that too. Thank you so much. Lots to think about, but just so clear. I really appreciate it.
All right.
Any other questions or comments before I just want to be sure I'm not cutting people off? No? Okay. Well, thank you, Mike. This is wonderful.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Everybody.
Have a
Thanks,
good night,
Mike. Very
everyone.
well done.
Great.
Nicely done.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.